Every morning, Mr. Harris would sit alone on the same park bench, watching the world go by. His hair was gray, his eyes carried a quiet sadness, and his days had long since fallen into a silent routine. The park, with its gentle breezes and familiar sounds, had become his only company. Ever since his wife had passed, life had grown empty, leaving him with only memories and a deep loneliness that seemed to linger in the air around him. Though people would pass by, few stopped to talk to the quiet old man, and he had grown used to the solitude. One morning, as Mr. Harris sat lost in thought, he felt a gentle nudge against his knee. Looking down, he saw a scruffy, thin dog with big brown eyes staring up at him. The dog's fur was rough and patched, clearly showing signs of a hard life on the streets. Yet, in those eyes, Mr. Harris saw a softness, a quiet plea for kindness. Unsure of what to do, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the remains of his sandwich, offering it to the dog. The dog eagerly took the food, eating quickly and then looking up, wagging his tail with gratitude. Mr. Harris felt an unexpected warmth in his heart. The small interaction filled a part of the day he had long stopped noticing, giving him a moment of connection. He patted the dog gently, watching as it leaned into his touch, clearly starved not just for food, but for affection. The dog stayed beside him for a while, content and still, and when Mr. Harris finally rose to leave, the dog watched him go, as if considering whether to follow. Mr. Harris walked away with a slight smile, feeling the smallest bit lighter, his loneliness momentarily lifted by that unexpected visitor. The next day, as Mr. Harris returned to his usual bench, he found the dog already waiting for him, sitting patiently with its tail wagging at the sight of him. Mr. Harris couldn't help but smile as he saw the dog waiting for him, tail thumping against the ground in excitement. It had been so long since anyone had looked forward to his arrival, even if it was just a stray dog. He sat down, and the dog immediately moved closer, resting its head on his knee, as if they were old friends. Mr. Harris patted its head, feeling a strange sense of comfort in the dog's presence, a warmth that he hadn't felt in years. He pulled out his sandwich again, breaking off a piece and handing it to the dog, who accepted it eagerly, chewing happily and looking up at him with grateful eyes. Mr. Harris found himself talking to the dog, his words flowing naturally as he shared bits of his day, his memories, and stories of his younger years. The dog listened, its eyes never leaving his face, as if it understood every word he said. People passing by noticed the pair and couldn't help but smile. The lonely old man who once sat in silence now had a companion, and his face seemed brighter, his posture more relaxed. Some of the regulars in the park started referring to the dog as Harris's shadow, for it never strayed far from his side. As the days passed, their bond grew. The dog would wait faithfully each morning, and Mr. Harris would bring an extra snack, setting aside a piece just for his new friend. He even began calling the dog Buddy, a name that felt right, like the dog had filled a part of his life he didn't realize he'd needed. As the weeks passed, Buddy became more than just a companion. He became a reason for Mr. Harris to wake up each day with a sense of purpose. Their routine became something sacred, a small joy that filled the otherwise empty hours of his life. Mr. Harris found himself lingering a bit longer in the park, sharing memories with Buddy that he had once locked away. He talked about his late wife, their small adventures, and the dreams they'd once shared. Buddy listened, with those soft brown eyes, his presence a comfort that words couldn't quite capture. One chilly morning, Mr. Harris arrived at the park only to find Buddy wasn't there. He looked around, expecting to see the familiar wagging tail, but the bench was empty. A pang of worry settled in his chest as he scanned the park, wondering if Buddy had moved on, He waited for hours, hoping Buddy would appear, but the park remained quiet and empty. He returned the next day, and the day after that, his heart growing heavier with each visit, the sense of loneliness creeping back in with an even deeper ache than before. Just as he was beginning to accept that Buddy might not return, a familiar bark echoed through the park. Mr. Harris turned to see Buddy trotting toward him, limping slightly but with his tail wagging and his eyes bright. Relief flooded over him, and he knelt down to greet his friend, noticing for the first time a small scar along Buddy's paw. Buddy nudged his hand as if to say he was okay, but something about his appearance told Mr. Harris that his friend had been through a rough few days. Curiosity mingled with concern as he sat back down, letting Buddy rest by his side. He wondered what had happened to his friend and what had brought him back after all this time. As they sat together, Mr. Harris felt an even stronger connection with Buddy, a bond forged not just by companionship, but by resilience and understanding. In the days that followed, Mr. Harris noticed that Buddy's limp didn't fully heal, and he began to worry. He tried to inspect Buddy's paw, but the dog would gently pull away, as if trying to hide his pain. Mr. Harris knew Buddy was tough, but the thought of his friend's suffering tugged at his heart. Determined to help, he decided to take Buddy to a nearby vet, hoping the dog would trust him enough to follow. When they arrived at the vet's office, Buddy hesitated at the door, his ears flat and his eyes filled with nervousness. Mr. Harris knelt down beside him, whispering gently, reassuring him that he would be safe. After a moment, Buddy gave a small nod, as if understanding, and allowed Mr. Harris to guide him inside. The vet examined Buddy's paw carefully, discovering that he had a minor injury that needed treatment, likely from his time wandering alone. While the vet cleaned and bandaged the wound, Mr. Harris stayed close, his hand resting on Buddy's head, offering comfort. Buddy watched him the whole time, his gaze unwavering, a silent trust passing between them. It was as if he knew Mr. Harris was doing this out of love, that he cared enough to ensure he was okay. As they left the vet's office, Buddy walked close to Mr. Harris, his limp improving slightly with each step. Mr. Harris felt a surge of joy, a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. In helping Buddy, he realized that he, too, was healing from wounds he hadn't even known he had. The companionship, the mutual care, it had rekindled something inside him, a sense of purpose that had once seemed lost. From that day on, their bond grew even deeper. Buddy, now fully healed, became a constant in Mr. Harris's life, a friend who brought him a warmth he hadn't felt in years. They had formed a routine that gave Mr. Harris something to look forward to each day, a reason to leave the house, to feel needed, and to share his time with someone who understood him in a way no one else did. Buddy seemed to sense this too, and he never let Mr. Harris out of his sight, staying close by, as if he too found comfort in their friendship. One afternoon, as they sat together on the park bench, Mr. Harris noticed a group of young children playing nearby. A ball bounced toward him, and Buddy jumped up, catching it with surprising agility. The children laughed and clapped, and Buddy eagerly ran back and forth, joining in their game. Mr. Harris watched, his heart swelling as he saw Buddy bringing joy to others, just as he had done for him. The laughter of the children and the sight of Buddy bounding around seemed to breathe new life into him. One of the children approached, a little girl with wide eyes, and asked, "Is he your dog, mister?" Mr. Harris smiled, glancing at Buddy, who was now panting happily at his side. "Yes," he said softly, realizing in that moment how much Buddy truly meant to him. "He's my best friend." The days continued in this way, each one filling Mr. Harris's life with a little more light, a little more purpose. Buddy had brought back pieces of himself he thought he'd lost forever. And in return, Mr. Harris gave Buddy a place to belong. He wasn't just a lonely old man anymore. He was Buddy's companion, his trusted friend, the one who had given him a home. One crisp autumn morning, Mr. Harris decided to take Buddy to his favorite place, a quiet spot by the river, where he and his late wife had once shared many peaceful afternoons. It was a place filled with memories, both joyful and bittersweet, and he felt that it was time to share this part of his life with Buddy. As they walked, leaves crunched beneath their feet, and Buddy trotted happily beside him, his tail wagging as he took in the new sights and smells. When they reached the river, Mr. Harris sat down on an old weathered bench, overlooking the water, and Buddy settled beside him, resting his head on Mr. Harris's lap. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the gentle flow of the river, both lost in their own thoughts. Mr. Harris felt a sense of calm wash over him, a quiet contentment that he hadn't felt in a long time. Having Buddy by his side made him feel connected again, both to his memories and to the present. After a while, Mr. Harris began to speak, sharing stories about his wife, their life together, and the dreams they'd once had. Buddy listened, his eyes soft and understanding, as if he could sense the weight of each word. The old man's voice wavered at times, but Buddy stayed close, offering silent comfort, his presence steady and reassuring. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the river, Mr. Harris felt something shift within him. The sadness he'd carried for so long seemed lighter, replaced by a gentle peace. He realized that, in Buddy, he had found a new kind of companionship, one that honored the memories of his past, but allowed him to live in the present. Buddy hadn't just filled the emptiness. He had brought healing, helping him to find hope again, one quiet moment at a time. In the days that followed, Mr. Harris found himself looking forward to each new morning. The simple routines he shared with Buddy, walking in the park, sharing quiet moments by the river, and even playing with the neighborhood children, had filled his life with a joy he hadn't expected to feel again. He was no longer the lonely man who sat in silence, lost in his memories. He was alive, fully present, and more connected to the world around him than he had been in years. One evening, as they made their way home from the park, a neighbor stopped him, smiling warmly. "I've never seen you so happy, Mr. Harris. That dog is a real gift, isn't he?" Mr. Harris nodded, looking down at Buddy, who sat beside him, tail wagging gently. "He saved me," he replied softly. "He reminded me what it feels like to be needed, to have someone to care for." Buddy glanced up at Mr. Harris, as if understanding the words, and gave a soft bark, leaning closer to his side. It was a simple moment, but one filled with gratitude and love, as if both man and dog knew how much they'd given each other. In that small, silent exchange, they acknowledged the journey they had taken together, the healing they had found in each other's company. As they reached home, Mr. Harris opened the door and stepped inside, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Buddy followed him in, settling down by his feet with a contented sigh. Mr. Harris looked around his home, realizing how much brighter it felt, how much less empty. It was no longer just a house. It was a home filled with companionship, laughter, and a bond that had healed his heart in ways he hadn't thought possible. That night, as Mr. Harris settled into his armchair with Buddy curled up at his feet, he found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed since Buddy came into it. The days of solitude, of endless hours spent lost in his memories, now felt like a distant past. Buddy had done more than just give him companionship. He had brought him back to life, filling his days with purpose, laughter, and warmth. As he reached down to stroke Buddy's fur, a thought crossed his mind, a desire to give back to the friend who had given him so much. The next morning, he made a decision. After their usual walk in the park, Mr. Harris took Buddy to the town's pet adoption center. Buddy was immediately greeted by the center staff, who recognized him as Mr. Harris's loyal companion. With a smile, Mr. Harris told the staff, "I'd like to adopt him officially. He deserves a home, a real home." The staff were moved, understanding the significance of the bond between them. Papers were signed, and at that moment, Buddy was no longer just a stray. He was officially part of Mr. Harris's family. That evening, Mr. Harris brought Buddy a new collar with a tag engraved with his name and their address. As he fastened it around Buddy's neck, he whispered, "Welcome home, Buddy." Buddy looked up at him with those warm, knowing eyes, and it was as if he understood. He nudged Mr. Harris's hand with his nose, then rested his head on his lap, a silent thank you for the love he had finally found. In the quiet of that moment, Mr. Harris realized that he had been given a gift far greater than companionship. Buddy had shown him that love could find its way back to him, even when he thought it was lost. And together, they had found a new beginning, a home, a family, and a bond that would carry them both forward, day by day, in the peace of knowing they would never have to face loneliness again. As time went on, Mr. Harris and Buddy settled into a life that felt both familiar and wonderfully new. The little house that once echoed with silence was now filled with the soft sounds of Buddy's footsteps, the gentle wagging of his tail, and the quiet joy of their companionship. Friends and neighbors began to notice the change in Mr. Harris, a warmth, a lightness that hadn't been there before. They saw him laugh, play, and talk more openly, always with Buddy at his side. One crisp winter morning, as snow lightly dusted the park, Mr. Harris and Buddy made their way to their favorite bench. The park, blanketed in white, was calm and serene, and the air held that fresh, hopeful quality that only winter could bring. Mr. Harris watched as Buddy bounded through the snow, his playful energy bringing a smile to his face. He hadn't felt this kind of joy since his wife had passed, and he marveled at how much his life had transformed. As time went on, Mr. Harris and Buddy settled into a life that felt both familiar and wonderfully new. The little house that once echoed with silence was now filled with the soft sounds of Buddy's footsteps, the gentle wagging of his tail, and the quiet joy of their companionship. Friends and neighbors began to notice the change in Mr. Harris, a warmth, a lightness that hadn't been there before. They saw him laugh, play, and talk more openly, always with Buddy at his side. One crisp winter morning, as snow lightly dusted the park, Mr. Harris and Buddy made their way to their favorite bench. The park, blanketed in white, was calm and serene, and the air held that fresh, hopeful quality that only winter could bring. Mr. Harris watched as Buddy bounded through the snow, his playful energy bringing a smile to his face. He hadn't felt this kind of joy since his wife had passed, and he marveled at how much his life had transformed. Sitting on the bench, he spoke softly, knowing that Buddy would listen. "You know, I didn't think I'd ever find this kind of happiness again," he whispered. "You've given me a second chance, Buddy." The dog returned to his side, resting his head on Mr. Harris's knee, his eyes filled with loyalty and love. In that simple act, Buddy reassured him, as if to say, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." As they walked home that day, Mr. Harris felt a deep gratitude for the little moments, the shared silences, and the unexpected friendship that had healed his heart. And as he unlocked his front door, with Buddy trotting faithfully by his side, he knew that he was finally at peace. The following morning brought a soft glow through the window as the first light of dawn touched the quiet room. Mr. Harris stirred, slowly opening his eyes, feeling the comforting presence of Buddy nearby. He stretched, feeling the familiar warmth in his heart that came from knowing he had a true companion by his side. As he sat up, Buddy lifted his head, his gentle brown eyes meeting Mr. Harris's with a look of affection and loyalty. They began their day together, following the familiar rhythm they had created. Breakfast in the cozy kitchen, a peaceful walk to the park, and a stop by their favorite bench under the oak tree. The air was crisp, but the companionship between them filled the chilly morning with warmth. Buddy trotted along beside him, occasionally pausing to sniff at the fallen leaves, his enthusiasm contagious as he explored each little detail. When they reached the bench, Mr. Harris sat down, watching Buddy as he wandered around with his usual curiosity. He noticed how Buddy seemed to find joy in the simplest things, and it reminded him to do the same. As he looked out over the park, he realized how different his life had become since Buddy came into it. Where once he had been surrounded by silence and memories, now he was surrounded by companionship and peace. After a while, Buddy returned to his side, nudging his hand with a soft, playful bark. Mr. Harris chuckled, patting his friend's head, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The world around them felt lighter, as if their friendship had brought a touch of magic to every day. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of growing older or facing the unknown. He had found not only a friend, but a source of strength and love that would carry him forward, no matter what the future held. With a deep breath, Mr. Harris rose from the bench, and together they walked home, side by side. In that moment, he knew he had everything he needed: a warm home, cherished memories, and a friend who had given him a second chance at happiness. And as they stepped through the door, he couldn't help but feel that life had truly come full circle, filling his heart with a sense of peace and contentment that would stay with him for all the days to come.